Regarding Men, number 51. Johnny Depp abuse? Always be recording.
Slap, but I was hitting you. It was not punching you. Babe, you're not punched.
Don't tell me what it feels like to be punched.
Even a lot of fights have been around a long time. I know. Yeah.
No, when you fucking have a closed
You
fist.
didn't get punched. You got hit. I'm sorry I hit you like this. But I did not punch you. I did not fucking deck you. I fucking was hitting you.
You can't
I don't know
deck
what
me.
the motion of my actual hand was. But you're fine. I did not hurt you. I did not punch you. I was hitting you. I was hitting you. I was hitting you. I was hitting you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to number 51 of Regarding Men. I think that's right, 51, right?
Yep.
I mean, we're 1 week shy of a year, and I think since we skipped a week, it's probably our year anniversary. Anyway,
Well,
number
happy
51,
anniversary.
happy anniversary, and I'm here with two of the people that I admire most in our men's work, Janice Fiamengo and Paul Elam. Both are long-term folks who have contributed a great deal, and I'm honored to be with them. And today, we're going to talk about a story. And it's a story that has a hashtag. And the hashtag is #BelieveThePirate. Okay, now what does that have to do with what the story is? And the story is about Johnny Depp. Johnny Depp, 2015, he had been divorced from his previous wife, who he had 2 children with. 2015, he married Amber Heard. Amber Heard, who he met on a movie set, I think something about rum. But he and Amber lasted about a year and a couple of months before they fell apart and had a divorce, which apparently cost Depp $7 million, which apparently Heard donated to charity.
Right.
It's like, what is going on here? And if you look at some of Depp's history, it's amazing how much money the guy spent. They were saying that he had monthly expenditures of $2 million. So it's like, okay. So folks, we're not talking about Joe Plumber and Jane at the cafeteria. This is a different kind of folk we're talking about today, and I don't want to try and defend him completely, but there are some things that we need to hear about. And one of the things is that during this split up, Amber Heard accused him of domestic violence. And it became a huge thing. And of course, with the Me Too stuff and he went to pot. They just tore him up. And he denied it. He said, no, I didn't do anything. In fact, he said, what was it he said? He said, she actually put on makeup to make it look like she'd been hit. Mm-hmm. And he said, we have proof of that because people who knew her saw her for the previous week. Each day of the previous week, she had no scars. And all of a sudden, they appear. So, no, this is bullshit, Depp said. But no one listened to him. All they listened to was Amber Heard. And, her idea about how she had been abused by this terrible man. Even though he had all kinds of testimony from his ex-wife and from his kids and from his whoever saying, this is the gentlest guy you're ever going to run into, which I'm not sure is exactly right. But still, he had plenty of evidence saying that he was not a perpetrator. But people believed her, no matter what. And apparently, he lost quite a bit. I think I read something where he had an estate of $650 million, and it's almost down to zero now. Whew. And that's a lot of cash. And then apparently he got dumped from the Pirates of the Caribbean series by Disney. Yeah. And they're thinking it was related to this whole thing. So really, he has paid a huge price for this allegation. And now, just recently, there have been some tapes that have come to the surface that have shown that, looks like Amber may not have been telling the very good truth. Mm-hmm. Because Amber says things on the tapes like, well, I didn't hit you with a perfect slap, but I hit you across the face anyway, or something like that. It's like she admits to violence. She admits to what she did. She doesn't deny what he says she did on the tape. And it's like, So now the hashtag is Believe the Pirate, right? Mm-hmm. Believe the Pirate. But today's discussion, let's talk about this, guys. What does this all mean? What does this have to do with the red pill? mean, because there's definitely pieces of the red pill that are involved with this. And let's hash it out. What do you guys think?
Well, one of the things I want to point out is that there's another hashtag. Amber Heard is an abuser.
Yes.
And it's trending.
It is trending.
On Twitter because of this. And it's good to see something like that. When you said that Depp lost $7 million in the divorce, he had to pay up $7 million,
right.
But you followed up with more. He lost tremendously.
Yes.
From these accusations, because that's what these accusations do.
Yes.
They ruin men.
Yes.
And I'm just waiting, guys, to hear the Hollywood Me Too crowd somehow try to spin this into Heard being the victim yet again. I'm not buying that they're going to turn on her for a second.
No, they're not going to turn on her. They're going to pull the same crap they pull in the research. And that is say she was defending herself.
Absolutely.
You know that's what's coming.
Even though she was saying stuff like he has heard on the tape saying, I'm not the one fucking throwing fucking pots and pans and shit like that and all this. And
bottles.
Her response to that was, that's different.
That's just throwing fucking pots.
That's just throwing pots. And she was angry at him because he told her there has to be no violence. Those were his exact words. And her response to that was to tell him he was wrong for not trying to engage with her and communicate while she's throwing stuff at him.
Yeah.
Right. Right. It's all his fault.
And I still think they'll turn this into Heard as victim.
Yes.
Before it's over.
I'm sure they will.
Clearly a very violent, aggressive perpetrator in this.
Yes.
And she's gotten away with near literal murder. She murdered his career over this. And they're probably still going to prop her up as a poster child for me.
Yes. She's too cute to be a perpetrator.
Yeah. Yeah.
But now, why did they get away with this? Why? What do you think?
Fits the perfect paradigm. I mean, this is a red pill story in so many ways.
Yes.
Here we have a woman clearly abusive. We hear her admitting that she is abusive and at the same time denying that she is abusive. It's amazing. She, in the same breath, yeah, sure, I hit you, and I can't promise I won't be violent in the future because I can't control myself. I get so angry, and yet it doesn't really count. You weren't hurt.
Right.
You weren't hurt, she says to him a number of times.
Yes.
What a coward you are for leaving. And we know that part of the reason that he's leaving, even when she isn't violent, that's one of the things that she really accuses him of, that he leaves sometimes when she's not being physically violent. It's because she's being emotionally and psychologically abusive. She's calling him names, she's screaming, she's out of control. We can hear her losing control over herself in the recording.
Yes.
And yet she doesn't recognize it at all. That's quite something. She has the gall, knowing that this recording exists. They made it, it was on her phone. They decided to make the recording together to talk through their issues. Knowing that this recording exists, she still went ahead, and in September, or in 2018, can't remember which month, she had published an article in the Washington Post, that horrific feminist rag, claiming to be an abuse victim.
Right.
Wow. So
yes.
So this is a really interesting example of why it is that women's violence is such an interesting issue in our culture, in that women are never taught to control themselves, clearly, never taught to control their anger and to control their propensity for violence, because they're told and believe that they can't really be violent. I mean, you couldn't get a clearer illustration of the whole problem of gynocentrism and how feminism has exacerbated that problem than this. The advocate for, women's issues, the advocate against violence against women, is herself violent admits she's violent and yet denies that her violence can hurt anyone, even though it involves throwing paint cans and bottles and all sorts of horrific missiles.
And
Just
that fits the profile of an abuser perfectly. Because the Duluth model tells us over and over again, abusers don't even know they're abusing. They won't admit anything. They're completely unaware of the abuse, you know? And that's exactly what we see in
Well,
Amber
it fits a Duluth model, except that she doesn't have a penis.
Oh,
Yeah.
no, how about that, Paul?
So she can't be the abuser, because if she is the abuser, then the Duluth model falls apart completely.
Yes, it
That's
do.
what one single female abuser does to the Duluth model. It shatters the whole thing. You know, Erin Pitsey, back in '71, coined a term called the emotional terrorist. And she wrote about this very eloquently. And I'm thinking, if we got this much on tape, this is just a few seconds out of that whole relationship. And she revealed enough about herself in that. Can you imagine what he was living with that was not recorded? The emotional terrorist in a home either gets that way or gets their way, or everybody suffers. And this is what I saw reflected in the recordings of them. If you would have just given me my way, if you would have just stayed, if you would have just done as you were instructed, I wouldn't have had to throw things at you.
That's an abuser.
You forced me to do this. You're the one that's responsible. And I have no doubt that she went out there, her borderline stuff as clear cut as can be, telling the world she's the victim with full conviction.
Right, that's what she thought.
Because after all, her reacting to him, to his terrible abuse by throwing bottles and other objects at him, well, that was self-defense. That was something she was forced into.
Yeah, it's
And
understandable.
this is the angle that feminists will take to eventually paint Amber Heard as the victim anyway, because they have to have her. As a politically speaking, Me Too cannot suffer this with Amber Heard as the perpetrator. They can't tolerate it. And they will come back and paint her as the victim in this. And so what if they're throwing a man? Now, hard for me to feel totally sorry for Johnny Depp for wondering aloud when the last time an actor killed a president. Politically speaking, he's not my cup of tea, but he deserves more justice than this.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly right.
And of course, the feminist defenses are already kicking in. You know, if you search Twitter, you can find all sorts of people saying it was mutually violent. You know, she was defending herself, and all sorts of things. I mean, people can hear, it doesn't matter how often the woman admits to her violence, people will hear what they want to hear. And I even found some things already. One woman, for instance, with, I don't know who she is, but with many, many followers, and this was liked 7,000 times. Interesting, saying Amber Heard's lies have hurt women who are actual abuse survivors. So we could have predicted that one, right?
Of course.
People who don't believe the women will say, look what happened to Johnny Depp.
You're damn right.
Yeah. So she does end, you know, to give her credit. This is just, I think, you know, she's not a feminist ideologue particularly. She ends by saying the whole thing is terrible. I hope Amber pays and Johnny gets justice. This is why victims need support. And actually the string in response to this was pretty good. A number of people challenged her on this thing about how it hurts women and said, you know, how about it hurts people who are actual abuse survivors, and that includes
How
men.
about it hurts men?
Yeah, well, and some
accusations hurt men.
Yeah, well, and some did say that, and some mocked her and said, you know, man abused, women hurt most, you know, and she even she even responded saying, you know, fair enough, you know. So it was actually a somewhat encouraging thread, because a lot of people did challenge her on this notion that women are somehow the victims when a woman is a victimizer. And so that was interesting to see, but you know, the spokeswoman for Heard is already spinning it in the feminist way, and I expect this is how the feminists will go with it. Here's what the spokeswoman said: anyone familiar with the dynamics of domestic abuse would immediately recognize what is really going on here.
Oh
I
yes,
thought-
of course.
That's amazing. In other words, anyone marinated in feminist ideology is going to immediately be able to fit this into their preconceived women as victim mold.
We see that going on in the Harvey Weinstein trial right now, where they bring in
Absolutely.
an expert to say, well, just because these women carried on relationships with their rapists years down the road, that's typical for rape victims.
We all do
It is
that.
Not
Yeah.
typical for rape victims to carry on relationships with the people who raped them.
Yeah.
That is absolutely, but this is going to be the spin.
Exactly.
There's a lot
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
pink hair.
Listen, this is how it unfolds. She even goes on. Throughout the extended tape recording that Johnny Depp vindictively turned over to the press, Ms. Heard repeatedly attempts to placate Mr. Depp, ignore his accusations, and force him to acknowledge what was really happening in their relationship. There it is, the entire feminist spinning of a confession of horrific violence and the man's repeated statements that he does not want there to be any violence in the relationship and that they need to separate as soon as she starts getting violent. And this feminist reads it as her placating him. So
Yes.
she's the victim. She's trying to get him to acknowledge what was really going on and what we all know was really going on, which was his abuse of her. I mean, it's amazing. So
It is amazing.
unfortunately, you know, I've seen lots of people on Twitter saying, you know, maybe this is the turning of the tide. You know, this is going to really hurt me too. And, you know, maybe people are going to finally see that men can be victims too, and women are not innocent, and women have the capacity. Nah, none of that is going to, you know, this is just going to
And
be.
can you imagine what would happen if one time he had restrained her to prevent her from throwing objects at
Right.
his head?
Right.
Yeah.
One finger.
And I'm
laid
sure
on
he did, you know.
self-defense.
Yeah, I'm sure he shoved her, you know, and to get past her when she was getting in his face screaming, you know, I'm sure he did various things like that, as anybody would. And
Right.
so that is going to be the evidence that this was a mutually violent, and that, you know, she was simply responding, and, you know, there's no victim, there's no clear perpetrator here, and so on and so on.
Well, once
Yes.
again, because your whole ideology is based on a foundation that men cannot be victims and
Yeah.
women cannot be perpetrators. So no matter if she would have killed him in this,
Yeah. Sure.
the defense at her trial, if she
Mhm.
had even been charged,
Yeah.
would have been the abuse defense. The
Yeah.
abuse.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I
Um,
think it's worth our talking about why that idea sticks, Paul. Why the idea sticks that women are the victims and men are the perpetrators. And it takes us to Tanya Reynolds' research
Yeah.
on moral typecasting, which I think is critical for us to know about. Because what Reynolds says is that people automatically, if they see two objects fighting each other and one is getting the better of the other, they'll assume that the one who's the perpetrator is the man and the one who's not, who's the victim, is the woman. This is automatic, folks. It's automatic. People assume this, you know. Not only that, but she went on to say that not only do people assume that women are the victims and men are the perpetrators, but compassion is almost always saved for the victim, and anger is turned towards the perpetrator unless the perpetrator is a woman, in which case the perpetrator then gets compassion. I mean, this is bizarre, but that's why we see what we see. That's why they can, Amber Heard can be heard by everyone as the victim, no matter what, and they'll see Depp as the perpetrator, because we do this automatically. This is built into the system.
I think is what we do as a species, actually, that feminists have always confused with the idea of misogyny. It is a lack of women's agency.
Yes.
And it is a subtle form of misogyny. I don't know if I want to say really misogyny, because I can equate misogyny with hatred. And this is more of a protective instinct, but it does rob women of agency.
Correct.
And
Correct.
that, by extension, would extend to disallowing them into spheres of life that we think we need to protect them from.
Right.
And I think this is what feminists have distorted into this evil mustache twirling hatred of women.
Right.
But we have, as a culture, robbed women of all agency. Amber Heard must be a victim. She couldn't possibly be a perpetrator because women aren't capable
Right.
of it.
Exactly.
Women don't have agency. They can't be held to account. They're children.
Yes.
They're little kids that must be treated as such.
Yes.
And that's the world we live in. And that's what they're doing now by going to rescue her. They're treating her like a child.
Yes. And
Yeah.
women weren't
To be fair,
oppressed.
she's acting like one.
She's
Women were
acting
not
like one.
oppressed. Women were treated like children. And that's the fact right there.
And we've now had 50 years. I mean, Tanya Reynolds mentions that this works against women in the sense that women who want to take on leadership roles have a greater difficulty in being seen as authoritative. Now, I'm not so sure about that really, but I would certainly say, okay, maybe that's true to some extent, or maybe it was true in the past. But we've had 50 years of very concerted, focused, active attention to that. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. It was all that yelling at the TV last night when I was watching the Super
You were
Bowl.
screaming at your husband, we know.
Yeah, right.
After
Yeah,
you beat him with the frying pan.
psychologically abusing him.
How many things did you throw at him?
Yes.
I did throw a pillow once. It was during a fight.
No.
And he laughed, so it was
guilty.
but to get back to Tanya Reynolds' research,
David, hashtag.
Janice is an abuser. To get back to Tanya Reynolds' really interesting work, I mean, and she made that point that women are disadvantaged by this denial of agency, and I have some trouble with it. I've not really noticed it that much, and maybe it is a slight point in that when women are angry, I think it's probably true that when women are angry, if they're in a boss position, that there is maybe a slightly more general tendency to see that as bitchiness, rather than if a man is angry as a boss, or somebody in charge, it's seen as a man asserting, his rightful authority, perhaps. Right. Maybe. But, we've had 50 years now of concerted attention to that issue. And, I think a lot of both men and women are quite willing to work against whatever deep-seated, tendency to stereotype women in that way might exist. But certainly we haven't had 50 years of attention, and we've had, in fact, a concerted refusal to pay attention to the ways in which our stereotypes about men disadvantage them and silence them and make it impossible, as in this case, for a man who is being hideously abused to talk about that. He was the one being abused. It's like a paradigm of our issues. He was the one being abused. He tried to talk about it. He wasn't believed, and in fact, he was punished by losing jobs and by having his reputation raked over the coals. It's really amazing. And just to get back to the feminist position again, I just recently I was doing some research into domestic violence and supposedly how violence against women increases after natural disasters. This was related to the charge, during the Australian bushfires, that men fighting the fires are going to come home and abuse their wives. I looked into the one study that was done on violence against women following the Black Saturday fire in Australia in 2009. I won't go into it because I did a whole video about it. It's really complicated, but the researcher there, who is the authority on domestic violence in Australia, her name is Deborah Parkinson. She actually says, and I'm sure this is just standard, it's not her particular idea. She actually says domestic violence is gendered, meaning that domestic violence is men's violence against women, where women's violence does not equate to men's in terms of frequency, severity, consequences, and the victim's sense of safety and well-being. So right up front, she says, I don't even look at women's violence against men don't even consider it in my study. Domestic violence is men's violence against women. So there it is, and she's the major researcher, one of the major researchers on domestic violence in Australia, who's responsible for speaking at conferences and advising, police services and emergency response teams and, all sorts of things about how they should respond to problems of family violence. So you couldn't have a clearer statement. I mean, that was in 2014, and it may be that some feminists have been forced by serious researchers to slightly rejig their definitions, but probably not very much. I mean, we've known since 1975 that the paradigm of the passive victimized woman and the violent male perpetrator is simply not true. And what difference has it made? The cultural assumptions, the deep-seated need to see women as innocent and as incapable of hurting anybody,
right?
Overrides whatever facts we were able to bring forward. So it's frustrating, but at least now we have researchers like Tanya Reynolds actually putting the data behind what so many of us have intuited and observed and declared to be true.
Yes.
Maybe eventually there'll be a more widespread recognition of the problem.
Indeed.
I want to go back for a moment and revisit what you said, Janice, about this trope of strong women are bitches and strong men are leaders, and the perception that we have of behavior, of strong behavior in both sexes. I think there's actually even more to that to discuss. What we have with men generally is when men in leadership positions or positions of power are jerks, we recognize that they're jerks. We recognize that they're not strong leaders, they're just abusive people, but we don't tend to attribute that to their sex.
That's a good point.
We attribute it to their personality.
Right.
And when you have women like Amy Klobuchar and Martha Stewart and others who are notorious for being abusive with people under them, we do tend to attribute that to the sex. I think that does happen. But part of the picture in this too is that I think for a lot of women new to the concept of being really powerful, that there is confusion between what's being powerful and being a bitch. And for a lot of these women, they think they're synonymous. And so they think they're picked on when people point out their behavior as being abusive and attribute it to their sex. But the fact of the matter is that the behavior is still abusive. It's still wrong. Nobody's confused about why they're acting that way.
Right.
They're confused about what power is and what being abusive is. And there's a difference between the two.
Interesting.
Very good point. Yeah.
And I think Amber Heard would be one of those who thinks she's a powerful woman.
Right.
And she is, unfortunately. Look at how she's destroyed this guy.
Yeah. 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 Well, it'll be very interesting to see whether feminists take this on and how they do so over the next little while.
They'll have to.
Well, we may end up talking about it here again because I have a feeling the feminists are going to give us fodder for another discussion.
Probably so. Probably so.
Probably so. Yeah.
Frame her as a victim somehow.
Because somehow I don't think Amber Heard's going to wind up in handcuffs.
Somehow I suspect not.
Probably not. So what's the takeaway we get from all this stuff, guys? What do you think?
Well, the takeaway for me is, as always, guys, always be recording. When you're in a high conflict relationship, that's when you start turning the recorder on. And be willing. I mean, the one advantage that Depp had in this was that he was able to get this out here. This is actually saving his name to some degree. It's not going to get his money back, but it finally gives the public a much clearer picture of what this relationship was like. Yes. Don't hesitate to record, and don't hesitate to consider the internet your friend. If you've been damaged by false accusations and you have recorded proof that those accusations are false, put it online.
Mhm.
Don't hesitate. Don't try to protect somebody who's lying about you. Always record.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, and I would also say that, what struck me was that so many people might have had their personal reservations about the way the story unfolded years ago, but didn't say much. And I think this is a cue to us that although it's very difficult to defend yourself when you're being accused, if you're the one that's being accused, it's not that difficult to stand up for somebody else. And unfortunately, I think too few men and women stand up for men when they're accused. And so if you hear a story and everyone is assuming that the man must be the perpetrator and that actions need to be taken against him, even though there's no evidence yet, and even though it's only the woman's word, that's the time to say, hold on, let's wait until we know the full story. Let's wait until we have some evidence before we move against this guy, before we smear him publicly, before we take action to discipline him in a workplace or, even to fire him, as happens all too often. So it's time to stand up for accused men.
Yes. Innocent until proven guilty.
Proof or STFU.
Mhm.
Stafoo, as
Yeah.
my son says. Stafoo.
Yeah,
Is that a good place to stop?
I think so.
I think so too. Thank you all. It's been good today.
Thanks
All
a
right.
lot.
We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
We'll see ya.